The Red Hollow was a place forgotten by most of the galaxy, a scar on the map of known space, a wound left open by millennia of violence. It was a planet constantly ravaged by war, the sky perpetually filled with the acrid haze of smoke and dust. The land was a fractured mosaic of ruined cities, battle-scarred landscapes, and scorched earth where nothing truly grew, only continued conflict. No faction was willing to yield, and no peace had ever lasted. It was the perfect place for a man like Jake Carver to be stranded, a soldier caught in the never-ending grind of intergalactic warfare. Jake, a hardened mercenary who had fought on 100 different worlds, had long lost count of the number of times he had fought for survival. His squad had been ambushed during a routine reconnaissance mission. A mission that was supposed to be nothing more than a means of gathering intelligence. But here he was, alone, stuck on the Red Hollow with no backup and no way to contact. His commanders, his ship, a battered old transport, had crashed in the middle of an alien battlefield, and now he was just another casualty in a war that would never end. As he stumbled from the wreckage, his body battered and bruised, Jake knew something had changed in him. He had grown used to the endless fighting, the bloodshed, but this planet, it felt different. It felt ancient, a world shaped by centuries of warfare, its wounds so deep that they bled constantly. It wasn't just a war zone. It was the very embodiment of conflict. Every faction on this forsaken planet had been locked in a battle for control for generations. Human mercenaries, alien warlords, corporate armies, rogue factions, and rogue AIs, all vying for dominance in a place that had long lost its purpose. But Jake was no longer just a mercenary. He had become a survivor. The taste of war had soured on his tongue, but as he walked across the ashes of the battlefield, a sense of determination began to build within him. He had a plan, and for once, it didn't involve simply surviving. He would end the war. He would unite the factions, and he would become their king. He had no delusions about what that meant. Jake knew the impossible odds that faced him. There were factions here that would not hesitate to kill him for his audacity, but that wasn't going to stop him. He had survived the brutality of countless worlds, and he could survive this one. More than survive, he could change it. His thoughts, however fleeting, turned to what he might become in this war-torn place. Not just a soldier, but a ruler. A king, if he could make it happen. The first step was clear. He would need an army. And armies, Jake had learned, were built on two things: fear and respect. In the distance, Jake saw the fires burning at the edges of the battlefield, marking the territory of a faction he knew well. The Black Talons, a mercenary group who had made a name for themselves across the galaxy, known for their ruthlessness and unflinching loyalty to whoever paid them the most. He could start with them. If he could win their respect, he could start building the momentum he needed. But he wasn't fool enough to think it would be easy. As he moved through the shattered city, a sense of foreboding pressed down on him. The city was eerily quiet, the chaos of the battle seemingly suspended in time. The silence was only broken by the distant rumble of explosions, the faintest hum of weapons being fired. The entire planet seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to shift. Jake could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the moment when his life would no longer be his own. He had come here as a soldier. He would leave as something far more dangerous. It would take everything he had, every ounce of strength, wit, and resolve he could summon. But for the first time in years, he wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for a purpose. As Jake neared the Black Talon camp, he paused, his senses alert. He was walking into the heart of an enemy stronghold, but he knew something the Black Talons didn't. The war was no longer just theirs. It was his now. With his declaration, he had drawn a line in the sand. He had declared himself their king, their ruler, whether they liked it or not. With a deep breath, Jake Carver stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. The Red Hollow, with all its violence and madness, was about to witness something it had never seen before. A human claiming the throne of a planet locked in eternal war. Jake Carver's arrival at the Black Talon camp didn't go unnoticed. He had been preparing himself mentally, envisioning a bold entrance, an offer of power, something they couldn't refuse. What he didn't expect was the sheer size and intensity of the operation. The camp was a fortress in the middle of nowhere, a hive of military precision and violence. The Black Talons didn't just survive here, they thrived, feeding off the endless war that raged across the Red Hollow. The first few steps inside the compound were cautious, measured. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their faces hidden behind visored helmets, eyes scanning the surroundings for threats. But Jake wasn't just another mercenary. He wasn't here to beg for a place in their ranks. He was here to take control. Carver, one of the soldiers, growled from his post, recognizing the name from the files of mercenary contractors across the galaxy. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jake didn't flinch. He didn't need to explain himself. Instead, he simply gave a half grin and raised his hand, motioning for them to step aside. "I'm here to make you an offer you can't refuse," Jake said, his voice steady, unwavering. The soldier's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon, but Jake's reputation alone bought him just enough time. The Black Talons were not fools. They had heard of him. The ghost soldier who survived impossible odds, the man who never backed down. He was dangerous, but so were they. The soldier hesitated, sensing a tension in the air, an undercurrent that hinted at something far more powerful than just a regular mercenary coming to trade punches. "What's this about?" The soldier's tone now held a touch of uncertainty. Jake's expression hardened. "You've been fighting a war that never ends. It's your turn to listen. I'm claiming this planet, the Red Hollow, and I'm making you all kings in it. If you want to survive, you'll bow to me, and if not, you'll find out exactly what happens when you cross me." There was a long silence before the soldier responded, eyeing Jake with a look of disbelief and suspicion. "You've lost your mind. You think you can just come here and—" Jake's voice cut him off. "You think you're the only ones with a monopoly on war, don't you? The Black Talons, the endless warlords, and the rest of these parasites all running around on this damned planet. I'm not asking, I'm demanding. You'll follow my lead, or you'll perish just like the rest of them. The choice is yours." The tension in the air thickened. The soldier's eyes flickered to the rest of his comrades, who had begun to gather around them, their weapons glinting under the pale red sky. They were a hardened group, but even they couldn't help but feel the weight of Jake's presence. Behind Jake, a voice boomed, cutting through the silence. "Enough!" A massive figure stepped forward, a hulking warlord clad in black armor, his face a mask of battle scars. "I'll decide whether you're worth the trouble. Get him inside. We'll see if you can back up that mouth of yours." Without another word, Jake followed the Black Talons into their stronghold, walking past armed soldiers who eyed him with both curiosity and growing wariness. The compound was a fortress of walls, weapons, and war rooms. The hum of technology filled the air, the sound of communication systems buzzing, and war strategists shouting orders into their comms. Jake had walked into the heart of chaos, but in that moment, he knew something they didn't. Jake had come for more than just survival. He had come to take control. As they reached the main war room, the leader of the Black Talons, a tall, imposing figure known as Captain Rax, stood with his back turned, reviewing data on a large holoscreen. He was a legend in his own right, known for his brutal tactics and cunning, but even a legend could be toppled. And Jake wasn't interested in playing by the rules of the warlords anymore. "Well, Carver," Captain Rax finally said without turning, "you've got my attention, but I don't take kindly to outsiders thinking they can just waltz in and make demands. What makes you think you can unite the Red Hollow?" Jake's gaze narrowed as he locked eyes with Rax's hologram. "Because I'm not an outsider. I'm what this planet needs. You've been at war so long you've forgotten. what it's all about. But I remember the pain of fighting for nothing. The endless bloodshed. I remember watching worlds burn, not for glory but for survival, and that's why I'm here, not to join you, to lead. Rax turned slowly, his eyes full of suspicion and amusement. You think you can end this war? Do you even know what you're asking? To rule the Red Hollow? You don't just need an army, Carver. You need allies, and more importantly, you need their trust. Jake smiled, his voice steady. I've fought for every inch of trust I've earned, and I know how to make enemies into allies. If I have to bleed for it, I will, but I will unite this planet, and when I do, you'll be kneeling before me. The captain stepped closer, his armored boots thudding against the floor. Bold words, but let's see if you can back them up. There are plenty of people who would love to see you fail. Jake didn't blink. I'm not here to play nice, Rax. I'm here to end this war once and for all, whether you join me or not. There was a long, tense pause before Rax gave a sharp nod. Fine. You've got one shot at this, Carver. You better make it count. The Red Hollow has no room for failure. As Jake turned to leave the war room, he felt a sense of purpose wash over him. The Black Talons had given him a chance, but the war wasn't just about earning their respect. It was about earning the respect of everyone on the planet. Humans, aliens, mercenaries, and warlords alike. And Jake Carver was ready for the fight of his life. Jake's declaration of war had stirred the hornet's nest. His audacity to claim kingship over the Red Hollow was a spark that set the whole planet on fire. What Jake didn't fully realize, however, was the depth of the entrenched hatred and bloodshed that ran through the veins of this war-ravaged world. The Black Talons had reluctantly given him the respect he demanded, but respect was fragile on the Red Hollow, easily shattered by a single misstep. Jake wasn't naive enough to think he could simply declare himself king and expect a smooth rise to power. The first signs of trouble came swiftly, as Jake attempted to consolidate his position. Trying to form tenuous alliances with other factions, he quickly discovered that the Red Hollow was no place for half measures. The various factions here were not merely enemies. They were cultures built on centuries of violence, betrayal, and mistrust. No one was willing to bend to his will without proving their strength, and every alliance was a potential powder keg ready to explode. Jake's first real test came when he attempted to meet with the Wythar, a nomadic alien species known for their brutal efficiency in battle. They had no fixed home, no leadership in the traditional sense. Instead, the Ythar were a confederation of warrior clans that roamed the Red Hollow, fighting for the highest bidder. Negotiating with them was a delicate affair, one that would either make or break Jake's claim. When he arrived at their encampment, a sprawling mass of metallic tents and war machines, the atmosphere was tense. The Wythar did not welcome strangers, especially humans, who they regarded as weak. Jake stood face to face with their leader, a towering figure known as Drakar, his thick, bony face covered in ritualistic scars, his eyes cold with suspicion. "You dare approach us, human?" Drakar's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "You, who are not even born of this soil, you think you can claim kingship over a land that does not belong to you?" Jake didn't flinch, even as the Ythar warriors surrounding him brandished their weapons. He had prepared for this moment. The Black Talons had given him the muscle, but it was his words that would have to win the Ythar. "I don't claim ownership over this land," Jake said, his voice steady but full of the weight of his purpose. "I claim leadership. This war has gone on long enough. Your people fight without cause, with no greater aim than the pursuit of bloodshed. But I will give you something to fight for, a future. I will unite this planet, Drakar. You can stand with me, or you can perish with the rest of them." Drakar's eyes narrowed, studying Jake with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "A future, you say? And what makes you think you can offer us that?" Jake stepped closer, unflinching in the face of the Ythar's intimidating presence. I've seen enough to know that the cycle of war must end. You know it too. But if you want to keep fighting, keep killing for nothing, then so be it. You're free to do that under my rule, or die trying to fight me for it." A long silence stretched between them as Carver considered the human before him. It wasn't just Jake's words that held weight. It was his conviction. Jake had the smell of a leader, a man who wasn't merely trying to survive, but who was willing to lead, no matter the cost. That alone made him dangerous. It made him a force to be reckoned with. "Very well, human," Carver finally said. "You may have your future, but know this. You will never control the Yathar. We are free warriors. We fight as we please. But for now, we will fight for you. Let us see if your future is worth the blood you've spilled." With that, Jake had secured the Yathar's allegiance, if only temporarily. But his victory was bittersweet. The price of that alliance was steep. He had gained the Yathar's loyalty through a display of power and intimidation, not trust. Their allegiance was precarious, built on the edge of a blade. Jake had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The next few days were a blur of negotiations and confrontations. Jake knew that to build a coalition strong enough to overthrow the existing power structures, he would need more than just the Black Talons and the Yathar. He would need to make deals with the alien warlords, with corporate armies and rogue AIs, each faction more dangerous and unpredictable than the last. One of the most powerful warlords on the planet was Drakar, an alien who had once been a leader in a failed rebellion against the planetary government before the war had started. Drakar's forces were vast, a highly disciplined army of mercenaries, but they were as ruthless as they were efficient. Jake knew that gaining Drakar's favor would be difficult, if not impossible, but he also knew that failure was not an option. His dream of uniting the planet under his rule depended on it. Jake's first meeting with Drakar was as tense as he expected. The Warlord was seated in a dimly lit room, surrounded by his most trusted officers, his cold eyes watching Jake with an unblinking gaze. "Carver," Drakar said, his voice low and dangerous. "I hear you think you can take control of this world. You're not the first to try, and you won't be the last." Jake took a step forward, locking eyes with the Warlord. "I'm not here to try, Drakar. I'm here to succeed. I'm going to end the war, and I'm going to make this planet my kingdom, but I'm not foolish enough to do it alone. I need your strength. Stand with me, and together we can bring peace to the Red Hollow." Drakar laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the room. "Peace? You've been on this world too long, human. There is no peace, there is only power. And you don't have it. Not yet." The tension in the room was palpable. Jake's grip on his gun tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew this was the moment. If he faltered here, everything would be lost. "You're right," Jake admitted, his voice firm. "I don't have it yet, but I will. And when I do, you'll be glad you were on my side." Drakar studied him for a long moment, as though weighing his very soul. Then, without a word, he turned and signaled to one of his officers. "You've got one chance, Carver. If you fail, you'll be nothing more than a corpse on the battlefield." As Jake left Drakar's stronghold, he felt a gnawing sense of doubt creeping in. He had won Drakar's conditional support, but at what cost? Every alliance he made was fragile, built on the shifting sands of trust and betrayal. The more he pushed forward, the more the line between friend and enemy blurred. But Jake had no choice. His vision for the Red Hollow was clear, and he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way, no matter the cost. Jake Carver stood at the edge of the battlefield, his heart pounding in his chest as the chaos unfolded before him. The Red Hollow was a planet born of war, and today it would see its most brutal battle yet. The factions that had once stood divided were now united by Jake's iron will, but that unity had come at a steep price. His alliances, forged through threats, promises and bloodshed were now being tested in the crucible of battle. The combined forces of the Black Talons, the Wythar, and Drakar's mercenaries were arrayed before him, a volatile mixture of soldiers, warlords, and warriors, ready to march into the heart of the enemy stronghold. Their objective was simple: to overthrow the ruling power that had held this world in its grip for centuries. The remnants of the original planetary government, a ruthless faction of corporate overlords and elite soldiers who had maintained their control through sheer force and terror. Jake's forces were outnumbered. He knew it, but he had something the others didn't: resolve. The fire that burned inside him was more than just a desire to survive. It was a driving force, a need to change the world, to reshape the fate of a planet that had known nothing but bloodshed. "This is it," Jake muttered to himself, staring into the distance as the enemy's defensive lines loomed on the horizon. This is where it all changes. The first shots rang out, and the ground trembled beneath Jake's feet as the battle began. Explosions rocked the landscape, sending plumes of dirt and debris into the air. The roar of gunfire and the hum of energy weapons filled the air, drowning out everything else. Jake's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. He had trained for moments like this. He had seen the horrors of war up close, and he had survived them. But this was different. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the future of the Red Hollow. His forces surged forward, clashing with the enemy in a violent storm of metal, flesh, and fire. Jake moved with them, his rifle raised, his mind focused on the objective. But even as his soldiers pushed forward, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The enemy's defenses were stronger than they appeared. Something had shifted in the air, an unnatural tension that set his nerves on edge. Then it hit him. A sudden, deafening crack split the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of energy shields collapsing. Jake's heart skipped a beat as a massive explosion tore through the front lines, sending soldiers flying through the air like ragdolls. The blast was so intense it shook the ground beneath him, and the world seemed to slow down as the shockwave rippled outward. In the chaos, Jake caught sight of the enemy commander, an armored figure who'd been standing behind the front lines, watching the battle unfold with detached amusement. The commander's face was obscured by a helmet, but Jake could see the cold, calculating glint in his eyes. This was no ordinary warlord. This was someone who had been orchestrating the war from the shadows, someone who had been pulling the strings long before Jake had ever set foot on the Red Hollow. Jake's instincts kicked in. He had to act fast. The battle was slipping from his control, and if he didn't take down the enemy commander now, the Red Hollow's brief moment of hope would be crushed under the weight of its own history. With a quick command to his subordinates, Jake broke from the main line, his body moving through the carnage with a deadly grace. He dodged blasts, rolled behind cover, and kept his eyes fixed on the enemy commander. He knew this was a turning point. If he failed, the planet would descend back into its endless cycle of war. If he succeeded, everything would change. He cut through the battlefield like a ghost, his focus absolute. His soldiers were fighting valiantly, but this was his moment. As he neared the enemy commander's position, he could feel the weight of the Red Hollow's history pressing down on him. This planet had been shaped by violence. It had been molded into a battlefield by those who had come before him. But Jake wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting to break the cycle, to prove that humanity could rise above it. The commander spotted him just as Jake closed the distance, and a surge of energy blasted in his direction. Jake dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast as it hit the ground with a thunderous crack. His rifle was raised, and in a single fluid motion he fired once, twice, each shot finding its mark. The commander staggered back, the blast from Jake's rifle knocking him off balance, but he didn't fall. Instead, he growled and with a swift motion drew a blade, an ancient weapon forged in the fires of the Red Hollow's first wars. Jake felt the air thicken with tension as the commander lunged forward, his weapons swinging with deadly intent. Time seemed to slow as Jake sidestepped the blow, the tip of the blade missing him by mere inches. His hand moved instinctively, drawing a combat knife from his belt, and in a flash, he was on the offensive, closing the gap between them. The two warriors collided in a blur of motion, each strike more brutal than the last. Sparks flew as their weapons clashed, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Jake's heart raced, but his mind was calm. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the future of the Red Hollow. He was fighting for a chance to end the cycle of war once and for all. The commander was strong, but Jake was faster. With a swift twist of his wrist, Jake disarmed his opponent, sending the blade skittering across the battlefield. The commander stumbled back, his face twisted in rage. "This is my world," Jake said, his voice steady, his eyes cold. "And you're finished." With a final strike, Jake drove his combat knife into the commander's chest, ending the battle with a single decisive blow. The commander crumpled to the ground, his body falling lifeless to the dust. Jake stood over him, breathing heavily, his pulse still racing. The battlefield around him fell silent. The war was over. For the first time in history, the Red Hollow had a chance to heal. Jake had taken the planet's darkest legacy and turned it on its head. He had declared himself king, and he had backed up every word with blood and steel. But even as the dust settled and victory hung in the air, Jake knew the price of his triumph. The war was over, but the world was still broken. The alliances he had forged were fragile, and the future was uncertain. He had won the battle, but the true test lay ahead. The real question was whether the Red Hollow would accept his rule or reject him, just as it had rejected every leader before him. Carver had won, but the war within, the war for his soul, had only just begun. The aftermath of the battle was silent in its own way. The fires that had burned so fiercely now smoldered in the distance, their red glow casting long shadows across the land. Carver stood alone amidst the wreckage, the weight of victory settling upon his shoulders like an unshakable mantle. The battle was won, the enemy commander slain, but the Red Hollow was far from healed. The land still bore the scars of centuries of war, and the people, though now united under his banner, were fractured and broken. There would be no easy path ahead. As Jake surveyed the battlefield, he could hear the distant sound of his forces, rallying, the shouts of victory mingling with the sorrow of loss. The Black Talons, the Ythar and Drakar's mercenaries, were celebrating their triumph, but Jake could see in their eyes the same uncertainty he felt within himself. They had followed him into battle, but they had followed a leader who was, still in many ways, as unknown to them as the Red Hollow itself. Their loyalty was earned in blood, not trust. And loyalty, Jake knew, was a fragile thing. In the days that followed, the Red Hollow began to shift, but not in the way Jake had expected. The factions that had once been divided were now forced to confront the reality of their unity. There were no easy alliances, no quick fixes. The planet's wounds were deep, and the bitterness of war had left lasting scars in the hearts of its people. Jake had risen to power through sheer force of will, but leadership was more than just the ability to fight. It was about healing, about guiding people through their pain and their loss, and that, more than anything else, would be the true test of his rule. He spent the next few weeks traveling from one encampment to the next, meeting with the leaders of the various factions, listening to their concerns and offering them a vision of a future that was no longer defined by war. The Black Talons, for all their mercenary spirit, had begun to see the value in Jake's leadership. Drakar, the leader of the Ythar, was still a reluctant ally, but even he had come to acknowledge Jake's strength. But it was Drakar who would prove to be the greatest challenge. The Warlord had pledged his allegiance to Jake under the promise of power, but as the dust settled, Drakar's true intentions became clearer. He was a man driven by conquest, not by the desire to see the Red Hollow heal. Jake's efforts to reach an understanding with him were met with cold resistance. Drakar still saw himself as the rightful ruler, and Jake's rule threatened that. One evening, as Jake sat alone in his quarters, his thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Carver, the towering leader of the Yaithar. The alien warrior stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his scarred face as unreadable as ever. "You've done it, human," Carver said, his voice low. "The Red Hollow belongs to you now, but don't think for a second that this will be easy. Drakar is still out there, and he will not bow to you willingly." Jake looked up at him, the weight of the words settling heavily in his chest. He had known this day would come, the day when his enemies would no longer be mere mercenaries or soldiers. They would become kings in their own right, and they would challenge him for control. But Jake had not come this far to back down. "I won't let him take it from me," Jake replied, his voice firm. "This war is over. We all know it. Drakar may have power, but I have something more, something he will never have. I have the trust of the people, and that is stronger than any army." Carver grunted, as if considering Jake's words. "You speak of trust, but trust is fragile. It can be broken with a single betrayal. You've already seen how the Red Hollow can turn on its rulers. Don't let your victory blind you." Jake nodded. The gravity of Carver. Jake nodded, the gravity of Carver's words sinking in. He had already seen the fractures in his alliances, the undercurrents of doubt and discontent. He had won the battle, but the war for the hearts and minds of the Red Hollow's people was just beginning. As Carver turned to leave, he paused in the doorway. "If you fail, Carver, it will not just be you who falls. It will be everyone." Jake watched him leave, the weight of the alien leader's warning settling over him like a storm cloud. He had gained the throne of the Red Hollow, but he knew it was not his by right. It was his by struggle, by blood, and by the willingness to fight for a world that had long since forgotten what peace looked like. The days turned into weeks, and Jake's rule continued to be tested. There were small victories, agreements reached, skirmishes quelled, dissidents silenced, but there were also moments of doubt. As much as he tried to unite the fractured factions, the old wounds of war ran deep. Some leaders refused to kneel before him, seeing him as nothing more than an opportunist. Others were unwilling to let go of their grudges, their thirst for revenge outweighing any hope for peace. Then came the day when Jake received word that Drakar had raised an army of his own, rallying the remnants of the old planetary government's forces. The Red Hollow's fragile peace was about to be shattered. Jake stood on the balcony of his stronghold, staring out over the vast, war-torn landscape. He had known this day would come, but the realization of it was no less crushing. He had fought for this world, for its people, but now it seemed that his victory had only made him a target. As he turned to face the gathering leaders in the war room, a grim resolve filled him. The Red Hollow was a land defined by war, by betrayal, and by power. But Jake Carver was no longer just a soldier. He was a king, whether the world accepted him or not. The war was far from over. But Jake knew one thing for sure. He would not go down without a fight. The war drums of the Red Hollow had not yet ceased their endless pounding. Jake Carver stood at the precipice of a world he had fought to shape, but the path ahead remained as uncertain as the war that had brought him to power. The moment of peace he had briefly glimpsed after the battle was fleeting, just another illusion. In a world that thrived on chaos, the factions he had once united now teetered on the edge of conflict, and Drakar's rebellion was the spark that could ignite the flames once more. But Jake wasn't the same man who had arrived on the Red Hollow, desperate for survival and driven by vengeance. He had changed. The scars he bore, both physical and emotional, were a testament to the brutal journey he had undertaken to reach this point. Leadership was no longer just a title. It was a burden, a weight that pressed down on his every decision. He had fought. For power, yes, but it was more than that now. He had fought for the future of the Red Hollow, for a world that had long been trapped in the cycles of war and bloodshed. The soldiers under his command no longer feared him simply as a mercenary or a conqueror. They respected him. But respect was a fickle thing, and the thin threads of loyalty he had woven were still fragile, still at risk of snapping under the strain of what was to come. Drakar's forces were mobilizing, and every step Jake took towards unifying the planet brought him closer to a confrontation that would either solidify his rule or shatter it completely. Jake stood in the war room. The maps of the Red Hollow spread out before him, detailing the shifting alliances and enemy positions. The once unstoppable momentum of his conquest now faced its greatest test. His alliances were growing increasingly unstable, with factions questioning his ability to hold together what had been forged in the fires of war. Some were loyal, others resentful, and the rest waiting to see who would come out on top. Trust was a commodity that couldn't be bought, only earned, and Jake had learned the hard way that it wasn't something you could force into existence. "I knew this wouldn't be easy," Jake muttered to himself as he studied the map. His hand hovered over the markers, tracing the routes of Drakar's army as they gathered strength in the outer regions of the Red Hollow. His thoughts drifted to the warnings he had received from Carver and the others. Their words had lingered with him, and now, as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, he understood the gravity of their advice. Trust was fragile, yes, but betrayal was a beast with many heads. The door creaked open, and Carver stepped in, his massive form silhouetted against the dim light of the war room. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was something in his posture, something that Jake had come to recognize as a subtle sign of respect, perhaps even camaraderie. "You've done well, human," Carver said, his voice as gruff as ever. "But it is not enough. Drakar is not a fool. His rebellion will not be easily crushed. We must prepare for what comes next." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know, but if we fall, we fall together. This planet, this war, it's bigger than all of us, but it's also our chance to prove something." "Prove what?" Carver's voice was sharp, a hint of frustration breaking through his stoic exterior. "That humans are as capable of failure as any who came before you?" Jake met his gaze, unflinching. "No, to prove that we're capable of something more, something better. The Red Hollow doesn't need another king. It needs a future, and I won't let it slip away." Carver said nothing for a moment, his gaze heavy on Jake, as if weighing his words. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Then fight for it. Fight like you've never fought before. But remember, if you're going to win this war, you'll need more than just strength. You'll need the trust of the people and the hearts of those who still doubt you." Jake's eyes shifted to the large holographic projection in the center of the room. The lines of conflict were drawn. His army was ready, but the question of whether the Red Hollow would stand or fall now rested in his hands. He couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not when so much had been sacrificed. As the warlords and leaders gathered in the hallways, preparing for the final battle, Jake stood alone, contemplating the legacy of his choices. The war for the Red Hollow was about to reach its bloody climax, and though his rule had begun with bloodshed and brutality, it could end with something more profound, a chance for redemption, a chance for peace, or perhaps the ultimate price. For his ambition, he wasn't just fighting for power anymore. He was fighting for humanity's place in a universe filled with endless conflict. He had come to the Red Hollow to survive, to conquer, But now, as the weight of responsibility pressed down on him, Jake knew that his fight wasn't just for the throne. It was for the future of the very world he had sought to tame, and with that, the final battle was set into motion. Jake Carver, once a soldier, now a king, would face the ultimate test. And as the Red Hollow stood on the precipice of war once again, the question remained. Would his vision for the future be enough to end the endless cycle, or would the cycle swallow him whole, just as it had every ruler before him? The fate of the planet and Jake's legacy hung in the balance.